In the decades preceding the Second World War, the world of aviation was gripped by a frantic, dizzying pace of change. Man had barely soared above the dunes of Kitty Hawk, yet already, the skies were filling with machines capable of transcontinental travel and breathtaking aerial combat. But for all the genius poured into biplanes and monoplanes, for all the complexity woven into their supercharged piston engines, they were approaching a fundamental, physical ceiling. The propeller, that spinning nexus of power that defined aviation for the first half of the century, was reaching its limits. As aircraft nudged closer to 400 miles per hour, the propeller blades themselves began to encounter their own sonic drag. Their tips sliced through the air so fast they created shockwaves, wasting precious energy and tearing themselves apart. To fly faster meant more powerful engines, which meant more weight, which meant more strain on the airframe, a vicious cycle that promised diminishing returns. The future, the true frontier of velocity, lay not in refining the reciprocating engine, but in abandoning it entirely. A few visionaries, scattered across continents and separated by political distance, imagined something entirely different. Aircraft powered by pure thrust, engines without pistons, without complex gearboxes, and without the inefficient, flailing arms of the propeller. They dreamed of speed beyond imagination, a new principle of flight that would divorce man from the tyranny of the internal combustion engine. Among them was a quiet, almost stubbornly persistent British engineer, a man whose modesty belied a relentless, revolutionary mind. His prototype would take flight years before the world was ready for it, a moment of blinding clarity and speed that should have changed history, but instead, disappeared almost without a trace, leaving behind only the faintest whisper of what might have been. To understand the isolation of this visionary, Flight Lieutenant Frank Whittle, one must first grasp the mindset of the British aviation establishment in the late 1920s and early 1930s. This was an industry dedicated to the known, the proven, and the practical. A fighter plane was defined by its Merlin engine, its propeller pitch, and its oil temperature gauge. When Whittle, a young, earnest student at Cranwell, first submitted his audacious concept, a paper detailing a gas turbine capable of propelling an aircraft, the reaction was not curiosity, but cold, institutional dismissal. The idea was deemed impracticable. The Air Ministry, the very institution designed to foster aeronautical progress, called his designs fantasy. The reasons were manifold. The enormous heat generated by a jet turbine would melt any known metal, the fuel consumption would be prohibitive, the mechanical complexity was beyond contemporary engineering. Whittle's brilliance was simply too far ahead of the curve. He was not merely suggesting an improvement to the current engine, he was proposing an entirely new physics of propulsion. The rejection stung, but it only strengthened Whittle's quiet resolve. He knew, with the certainty of mathematical proof, that his turbine was the only way past the propeller wall. He was not a dreamer, he was a practical engineer who saw the inefficiency of a piston engine, an incredible machine that spent most of its energy simply moving itself, not the plane. The pure reaction thrust of a jet, however, offered an elegance and simplicity that was irresistible. He would not let the world's skepticism bury the future. Denied military funding, Whittle pursued his vision with the help of a few crucial allies, most notably two former RAF officers, Rolfe Williams and J.C.B. Tinling, and later, the engineer L.G. Charteris. Together, in 1936, they scraped together meager private funds and formed a company with an impossibly grand title for its humble beginnings, Power Jets Limited. Their initial workshop was a study in resourceful improvisation, a modest corner of the British Thomson Houston (BTH) factory in Rugby. There, amid the grime and the conventional machinery of an electrical engineering plant, the foundations of the jet age were laid. Whittle's design was a centrifugal jet engine. Air was sucked into the center, flung outward by a massive impeller, like a complex fan, compressed by the force, mixed with fuel in combustion chambers, and ignited. The resulting blast of hot, high-velocity gas spun the turbine wheel that drove the impeller, before being expelled out the back as pure, powerful thrust. It was a controlled explosion, continuous and sustained. The challenge was monumental. Every component had to be designed from scratch. Combustion chambers refused to light consistently. Turbines, spinning at previously unheard of speeds up to 17,000 revolutions per minute, warped and shattered. Metallurgy, the study of the heat resistance of metals, was the true battleground. The materials that could withstand the 800 degrees Celsius temperatures of the combustion chamber simply did not yet exist. They relied on guesswork, trial and catastrophic failure. Yet, inside that modest workshop, in April 1937, the Whittle unit prototype roared to life. It was a terrifying, beautiful moment. The engine was small, unstable, and had to be constrained inside a concrete casing for fear it would tear itself apart. It screamed, it glowed, and it produced enough thrust to lift a small aircraft. The future had arrived, but hardly anyone noticed. Funding remained scarce, and the shadow of the coming war loomed heavily on the horizon. Britain needed Spitfires and Hurricanes, they needed Wellington bombers, they needed the established tools of conflict, not the dreams of a quiet engineer. Part 2. The Quiet Revolution, 1939–1941. The outbreak of war in September 1939 changed everything, not immediately, but gradually. The necessity of war quickly exposes the inadequacy of existing tools. As the Battle of Britain drew closer, the desperate scramble for any technological advantage finally forced the Air Ministry, specifically the small, forward-thinking section known as RAE, Royal Aircraft Establishment, to take Whittle seriously. Reports of parallel, shadowy research programs in Germany, programs involving names like Heinkel and Pabst von Ohain, lent an urgent, terrifying credibility to Whittle's fantasy. In 1939, the Air Ministry covertly placed an order for a flight-ready prototype engine and an experimental aircraft to carry it. The project, designated E-2839, Experimental Aircraft Specification 2839, was shrouded in a blanket of absolute secrecy. It was clear the jet was now a matter of national survival, but its existence could not be risked on a conventional airfield or within the reach of German reconnaissance. The design team required was small, discreet, and utterly professional. The Air Ministry turned to the Gloucester Aircraft Company in Hucklecote, Gloucestershire, known for its expertise in building high-performance fighters. The chief designer, George Carter, a man known for his pragmatic engineering brilliance, was tasked with creating an airframe that would be fast, light, and robust enough to handle the engine's unprecedented thrust and vibration characteristics. The collaboration between Whittle's power jets, focused on the engine, now designated the W-1, and Gloucester, focused on the airframe, was a marriage of theoretical genius and practical metallurgy. Carter's challenge was immense. Unlike a propeller aircraft, the jet required a straight path for air intake and exhaust. The fuselage could not be blocked by a massive reciprocating engine in the nose. Carter designed a sleek, shoulder-winged monoplane that was unlike anything else in the RAF inventory. It was compact, deliberately simplistic, and almost minimalist. The single W-1 engine was situated in the belly of the aircraft, just behind the cockpit, providing the straight-through ducting needed. This layout immediately gave the E-2839 its distinctive, almost toy-like appearance, smooth and clean, devoid of the complex, angular features of its propeller-driven contemporaries. The construction itself was a testament to the wartime shortages and the need for speed. While the body was largely metal, it retained traditional fabric and plywood elements for lightness and ease of modification. Every line was dedicated to minimizing drag. The pilot sat high, forward, and alone, enclosed under a small bubble canopy, looking out over a machine that promised a future he could barely yet imagine. The airframe was a silent, empty promise until the W-1 engine was installed. The W-1, weighing approximately 600 pounds, was a fragile, high-strung beast. It was small, barely the size of a modern wheelbarrow, but it possessed the power of several hundred horses, delivered not through a shaft, but as pure, raw kinetic energy. As the machine took shape in the Gloucester workshop, the security surrounding the entire project was suffocating. Every component was referred to by code. Workers were compartmentalized, many unaware that the strange pipe and turbine assemblies they were handling were not some new type of supercharger, but a revolutionary engine. The project moved locations frequently, constantly hiding its activities from potential spies and, more pertinently, from the prying cameras of German reconnaissance aircraft. The final assembly and testing site was chosen with extreme care: the remote, expansive airfield at Brockworth, Gloucestershire, and later, the more secure RAF Cranwell. This was a realm of perpetual darkness and silence, where the jet's secret could be protected. The threat was palpable. The Blitz was at its height. Every night, the air shook with the sound of conventional, piston-driven bombers. The contrast between the chaotic, messy reality of the war raging above London and the sterile, silent revolution taking place in Gloucestershire was profound. The engineers knew they were working on something that could alter the trajectory of the entire conflict, but time was running out. Germany's own jet programs, though unknown in their specifics, were a known shadow looming over the horizon. Part 3. The First Breath of Fire. To fly a revolutionary aircraft, one needed a revolutionary pilot. The man chosen to take the E-28 39ths into history was Jerry Sayre, Gloucester's chief test pilot. Sayre was not a theatrical barnstormer. He was a meticulous, analytical professional, a man whose temperament matched the scientific precision required for the flight. Sayre had to learn an entirely new discipline. Flying a piston aircraft involved managing engine RPM, oil pressure, propeller pitch, and throttle in a complex, manual dance. Flying the jet was startlingly different. The acceleration was slower than a piston engine at low speeds, requiring long runway rolls, but once in the air, the engine response was immediate and immense. There was no propeller noise, no vibration, only the sensation of being smoothly, quietly pushed forward by an invisible hand. The primary difficulty was the throttle response. Whittle's early engine was prone to overheating and turbine damage if the throttle was moved too quickly. A rapid increase in fuel would instantly vaporize the engine. Sayre had to train himself to use the controls with a slow, almost agonizing deliberation, a complete contradiction to the instant reflexes required in fight or flight. He had to think of the engine not as a mechanical tool, but as a living, heat-sensitive furnace. The weeks leading up to the final flight were filled with taxiing trials. The E-28 39ths, looking more like an oversized laboratory experiment than an aircraft, would be towed onto the perimeter track at Brockworth. Sayre would start the W-1. It would light up with a sharp whistle, followed by the sight of hot, shimmering exhaust air. The first movement trials were cautious, little more than fast taxi runs down the runway. The final day arrived, May 15, 1941. The location was now the broader, more isolated runway at RAF Cranwell. The weather was cool, clear, and utterly calm, perfect for testing the delicate machine. Only a handful of individuals were present: Whittle, Charteris, Carter, the ground crew, and key Air Ministry officials, a silent, tense congregation watching the culmination of 13 years of struggle. The engine was started. Unlike the stuttering cough and thunderous roar of a piston engine catching, the W-1 began with an electric whir, followed by a rising, intense whistle, the sound of air being brutally compressed and expelled. It was a high, inhuman sound, utterly foreign to the wartime airfield. Sayre gave the thumbs up from the cockpit. He slowly, deliberately, eased the throttle forward, waiting for the turbine to spool up. The jet began to move. Slowly at first, then gathering speed with a terrifying, smooth inevitability. The roar of the W-1 was directed behind it, masking the sound for those standing beside the runway. To the few witnesses, the sensation was one of pure, accelerated motion unaccompanied by familiar noise. It was a visual paradox, an aircraft gathering impossible speed with a mere whoosh, leaving behind only a heat haze and a faint scream high in the acoustic range. Sayre held the jet down for a long roll. At 17:45 British Summer Time, the Gloucester E-28 39ths lifted smoothly into the sky. The takeoff was gentle, almost serene. The moment the wheels left the ground, the E-28 39 ceased to be an experimental machine and became a phenomenon. For 17 glorious minutes, the E-28 39 became the fastest aircraft Britain had ever seen, breaking the 400 miles per hour barrier with effortless ease. Sayre, sitting in the cockpit, experienced a new reality of flight. There was no propeller wash, no vibration, only a profound, almost unnerving silence punctuated by the distant scream of the turbine, the sound seeming to lag behind the aircraft itself. He reported later, "It was so smooth, so quiet in the air. The speed was the most unbelievable part. I knew then we had something utterly new." Pilots and engineers on the ground stared in disbelief. They saw a machine that defied the logic of their profession. It left no complex spiral of propeller wash, no desperate chatter of cooling fans, only speed and the faint, breath-like trace of fire. In that moment, Britain had quietly, secretly entered the jet age. But the world, in the desperate struggle of the Blitz and the U-boat war, was too busy fighting for its present to notice the future that had just passed overhead. The flight was not just a technical success. It was a philosophical declaration. The age of steam and pistons was over. Part 4. the pressure of parallel programs. The flight of the E-28-39 was a scientific triumph, but the military realization was slow and painful. Whittle's W-1 engine, while revolutionary, was a sensitive laboratory piece, not a robust war machine. Its longevity was measured in mere tens of hours before a complete rebuild was necessary, and its materials were dangerously close to their thermal limit. The military required reliability, endurance, and, crucially, a dramatic increase in thrust to carry weapons and armor. Power jets immediately began work on the next generation, the W-1A and the powerful W-2B, the engine that would eventually power Britain's first operational jet fighter. But the bureaucratic inertia, which had plagued Whittle for years, did not vanish overnight. While the engineers toiled relentlessly, the Air Ministry remained cautious. The priority remained clear: protect Britain now. This meant building more Spitfires, more Hurricanes, and especially, more heavy bombers with the proven, reliable Merlin engine. The jet program, though exciting, remained an expensive luxury, a secret project that could not be allowed to distract from the main war effort. Even as Whittle's jet flew into history, unknown to him, his counterparts on the continent were making similar, and arguably more militarily effective, leaps. While Whittle pursued the centrifugal design, German engineers, notably at the Heinkel and Junkers companies, were developing the axial flow jet engine. The axial design, where air passed straight through the engine in a linear fashion, was physically more complex to engineer but offered immense advantages: a smaller frontal area, which meant less drag, and a significantly higher potential for scaling up thrust. Germany's initial jet flight, the Heinkel He-178, actually preceded Whittle's by almost 2 years, flying in August 1939. This early success was also dismissed by the German High Command, but the program quickly gained traction. By the time the Gloster E-28-39 made its 17-minute flight, German engineers were already preparing the Messerschmitt Me 206, a larger, twin-engined, swept-wing design destined to become the world's first operational jet fighter. The difference in approach was critical. Britain E-28-39, a pure research tool. Small, light, designed only to prove the principle of jet propulsion. Germany Me 262, designed from the ground up as a heavy, armed, operational fighter. The Gloster E-28-39 was a pioneering moment, the Me 262 was a weapon. Both were born from the same fundamental idea, but the German system, once convinced, leveraged its greater industrial capacity and a more ruthless sense of urgency, quickly transforming the fantasy into a deadly reality. The immediate, urgent necessity for Britain was to transition from the E-28-39's proof of concept to an operational machine. This led to the development of the Gloster Meteor, the first production-ready British jet. However, the British decision to stay with the technically simpler but larger centrifugal engine, Whittle's design, meant that the Meteor was a generation behind the Me 262 in aerodynamic efficiency and speed potential. The engine pods had to be large and bulky to house the massive impeller. Furthermore, the bureaucracy and ingrained wartime conservatism slowed the transition. Production lines for piston engines could not be halted. It took 4 years from the E-28-39's first flight in 1941 for the Meteor to finally enter service in the summer of 1944. By that time, the war had changed. The Me 262 was already on the scene, terrifying Allied bomber crews. The British had won the technical race by proving the concept, but they were rapidly losing the operational race. The dream had come true, but too soon to decisively matter in the war's desperate middle years. Part 5. Overshadowed and forgotten. The E-28-39 served its purpose brilliantly. It proved that a single-engine jet was stable, controllable, and delivered speed far beyond its contemporaries. It provided the data, the thrust ratings, and the confidence needed to launch the Meteor program. But the prototype itself, the machine that first carried man into the true jet age, was quietly retired. It was an experimental mule, delicate and high-strung, and it had done its job. Its airframe was exhausted from the extreme testing, and its W-1 engine was deemed too fragile for continued flight. The jet, which had flown with such revolutionary silence and speed, was towed into a hangar and covered with tarpaulins. Its achievements were quickly buried under layers of classified reports, wartime secrecy, and the immense logistical bureaucracy of a global conflict. Its fate reflected the inherent contradiction of the project. a world-changing secret that had to remain secret to survive. It was the first, and therefore, irrelevant to the final outcome of the war. The Gloster E-2839s never fought, never bombed, never defended. It simply opened the door, then stepped back into the shadows. The irony was heavy. The only reason the Me-262 failed to change the outcome of the war was not a failure of German engineering, but a failure of command. Hitler, obsessed with retaliation, insisted that the Me-262 be deployed primarily as a bomber, blitzbomber, rather than a fighter, crippling its tactical deployment and slowing its production. Had the Me-262 been deployed en masse a year earlier, focused purely on air superiority, it might have truly devastated the Allied bomber offensive. The German axial flow jet, the better weapon, was hamstrung by its high command. The British centrifugal jet, the Pioneer, was hamstrung by cautious bureaucracy and a necessary focus on existing infrastructure. Whittle's design was the better engineering achievement for its context, the German design was the better military weapon. In the crucible of 1944-45, only the weaponized version mattered. The Pioneer was forgotten. Whittle's greatest operational impact came not in the skies over Britain, but across the Atlantic. Recognizing the inherent limits of their own early jet research, and desperate to catch up to the Germans, the American government desperately sought access to Whittle's technology. In 1941, in a massive technological transfer mission, Whittle's team sent the W-1X, and earlier, non-flight engine and crucial technical drawings to the United States. This exchange was foundational to the birth of the American jet industry. General Electric (GE) quickly adapted the design, leading to the creation of the GEIA engine, which powered the American prototype jet, the Bell P-59 Aerocomet. Thus, the DNA of the Gloster E-2839s, the centrifugal, robust design, was immediately implanted into the U.S. industrial machine. Though it was retired in Britain, the jet's heartbeat was immediately adopted by the nation that would dominate the post-war air forces. It was a victory by proxy, a quiet donation of the future. The story of the jet is also the story of Frank Whittle's personal sacrifice. The constant struggle against skepticism, the relentless demands of the wartime program, the high heat, and the constant threat of failure took a devastating toll. By the time the Meteor was operational, Whittle was physically and emotionally exhausted, suffering from severe health problems induced by stress. His genius was recognized belatedly. He received a knighthood, but the public credit and the financial rewards were disproportionate to the magnitude of his invention. The fame, when it finally arrived, was bittersweet. He had delivered the future, but the sheer effort had cost him his health and much of his personal life. The E-2839s, the fragile machine that represented his purest moment of triumph, thus became a monument not just to speed, but to the sacrifice of the lone innovator battling the weight of consensus. Every jet that followed, every massive, intercontinental airliner, every supersonic fighter, every sleek business jet, carries the DNA of the E-2839s. It was the machine that successfully decoupled flight from the age of propellers. The technological leap was absolute. The jet offered altitude. Jets perform far more efficiently at high altitude, where thin air offers less drag. Piston engines gasp for air, jets thrive. This opened up the stratosphere for commercial and military flight. Simplicity. Though complex to build, the operational simplicity of the jet one moving part, the turbine compressor assembly compared to the thousands of moving parts in a piston engine was a maintenance dream. Endless speed. The ceiling of speed was suddenly lifted. The sonic barrier was now a technical challenge, not an insurmountable physical one created by the propeller itself. The E-2839 was the mathematical equation made airborne. It was the blueprint for the next 70 years of aviation. History, however, rarely remembers the first to arrive, it remembers the first to win, the first to be mass-produced, or the first to draw blood. The Messerschmitt Me-206 remains the iconic jet of the Second World War, a frightening, lethal symbol of technological prowess. The Gloster Meteor is remembered as the first operational Allied jet. But the Gloster E-2839s, the pure, silent vessel of Whittle's dream, vanished in silence. It was dismantled, studied, and eventually, one of the two constructed prototypes was preserved. It now rests in the Science Museum in London, a muted silver ghost among the thunderous relics of the propeller age. There, Stripped of its wartime urgency and its revolutionary context, it appears almost quaint. But for those who know its story, for those who can hear the faint, rising whistle of the W-1 engine on that cold May afternoon, it remains the most important aircraft of its era. It was the moment that the concept of jet travel moved from the margins of a student's paper to the reality of the sky. The legacy of the E-2839s is not one of battle honors or mass production statistics. It is a legacy of profound transition. It represents the fleeting moment when the impossible became merely difficult, the moment when the future decisively severed its ties with the past. Whittle's jet was too early to save Britain from the Blitz, and too fragile to fight in the great air battles of 1944. Its timing was perfect only for history books and theoretical physics. It was the prototype that never quite got its spotlight, the unsung prophet of the supersonic age. And so, the jet that flew before its time, the beautiful, silent creation of a stubborn engineer, vanished in the noise of a conventional war, leaving behind only the faint, powerful echo of the future it had brought into being. The revolution was quiet, but its consequences reshaped the world forever. The silence of that first flight speaks louder than any engine roar.